courtroom was thick with smoke when Errol Flynn faced charges that should have ended him. Yet Warner Brothers, with their money and power, bought his freedom. Mae West built her legend on stolen wit, while Clark Gable walked away from a fatal wreck erased by MGM's fixers. These are 17 Hollywood stars whose crimes and corruption were often buried in shadows, but never truly forgotten. Number 1. Errol Flynn, the pirate of predation. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with cigarette smoke and whispered judgment. In 1942, at the height of his fame, Errol Flynn sat in the defendant's chair, accused of misconduct with 2 girls. His films were still showing in theaters: The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, Captain Blood, 1935, but his career teetered on the edge of collapse. Warner Brothers threw its weight behind him, hiring the best lawyers money could buy, coaching witnesses, and making sure newspapers focused more on his charm than the charges. Against all odds, the jury found him not guilty. And so, instead of ruin, Flynn walked away with a new reputation: dangerous, reckless, untouchable. To his fans, he was the dashing hero swinging from chandeliers, the man who could laugh in the face of death. Off-screen, the reality was far darker. Flynn prowled Hollywood parties, yachts, and hotel rooms, his private life a storm of late-night escapades and whispered scandals. There were rumors of film reels showing things never meant for public eyes, locked away in vaults, or seized by Warner fixers before they could leak. And when gossip columnists like Luella Parsons circled too close, the studio intervened, trading favors to keep their leading man's name gleaming. But Flynn's troubles went beyond women and whiskey. By the 1950s, whispers grew that he had ties to espionage, accused of sympathizing with enemies during the war and maintaining questionable friendships abroad. Whether fact or smear, the damage was done. The swashbuckler who had once embodied freedom and daring now carried the shadow of betrayal. His health collapsed under years of indulgence, his once athletic frame wasted. Errol Flynn died in 1959 at just 50. His final years marked by bankruptcy and scandal, yet Hollywood still sells him as the eternal Robin Hood, smiling from Technicolor forests. That smile, however, masked a darker truth. Behind the laughter and legend was a man shielded by a studio machine that decided money was worth more than morality. The irony lingers. Errol Flynn stole hearts on screen, but off-screen, what he took left scars Hollywood never admitted. Number 2. Mae West, the thief of wit. She leaned against a doorway, tossed a glance, and delivered a line that could melt a censor's pencil in midair. "When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better." Audiences roared. Yet few in that crowd knew the line wasn't hers. For behind Mae West's rhinestones and drawl, there were shadow voices. Vulnerable writers whose wit she took and branded as her own, silenced by the threat of blacklists and ruined reputations. Mae West wasn't born into stardom. She built it with clawed hands and sharper words. By the early 1930s, she had stormed Paramount with films like She Done Him Wrong, 1933, the very picture credited with saving the studio from bankruptcy. Her bawdy humor, heavy-lidded eyes, and purring innuendo made her a cultural shockwave. But behind the curtains of Paramount's lot, whispers circled. Some of her most memorable zingers had already been told, written by men who could never claim them publicly. At a time when homosexuality was criminalized, the gay playwrights and club comics who gave her material were too vulnerable to fight back. She gathered their jokes like trophies, a clever turn of phrase heard in a Greenwich Village speakeasy, a biting innuendo scribbled in the margins of a struggling writer's script. Mae would polish them, deliver them in that slow, sultry rhythm, and the world believed she was Hollywood's unrivaled wit. Studios and censors battled her words, but the true authors were already defeated, trapped in silence, unable to risk exposure. By the late 1930s, her dominance began to fade. The Hays Code clamped down, silencing double entendres, and audiences slowly grew weary of the routine. Without fresh material, or the daring young voices she had once stolen from, Mae drifted into self-parody. She tried comebacks, even appearing alongside younger stars decades later. But the sparkle had dulled. The cruel irony? Mae West became immortal as the woman who always had the last word. Yet those words were often not her own. Mae's greatest act of seduction was convincing the world she'd written the lines herself. Number 3. Clark Gable, the king who got away with murder. It began with the sound of twisting metal on a dark California road. In 1945, Clark Gable, Hollywood's most bankable leading man, allegedly walked away from a wreck that left another man dead. But the headlines never came. The whispers said MGM's legendary fixers, Howard Strickling and Eddie Mannix, swept in, scrubbing police reports and silencing witnesses. The scandal that should have ended him became another buried secret. And the King of Hollywood carried on as though nothing had happened. For audiences, Gable was forever Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. 1939, the rakish rogue with the crooked grin who made defiance look like charm. Off-screen, that charm covered a darker trail. His marriage to Carole Lombard was a rare bright light. But after her tragic plane crash in 1942, Gable spiraled. Studio insiders claimed his grief was real, but so were his vices. Late-night binges, affairs with co-stars, and reckless driving that left even friends shaken. Yet MGM's publicity machine painted him as the grieving widower, the noble patriot, and eventually the decorated soldier, though even his military service was heavily massaged by studio press agents. The rumors grew. On sets like The Misfits, 1961, Marilyn Monroe whispered about his affairs. Crew members told stories of drunken rages and whispered cover-ups. Gossip columnists, who never missed a scandal, somehow stayed silent when it came to Gable's most dangerous slips. And each time, MGM's fixers were there, ready to buy silence, bury evidence, or frame another narrative. What makes Clark Gable's story sting is the double image. The man who declared, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," on screen, and the man who lived those words off it. Hollywood crowned him royalty, but his throne was built on secrets, payoffs, and the lives of those left behind. In the end, Clark Gable's legacy remains untarnished in the public's memory. The mustached king of romance and rebellion. But in Hollywood's smoky backrooms, the truth was whispered plainly. Clark Gable was the star who should have fallen and didn't. Number 4. Joan Crawford, Hollywood's blackmail queen. She never walked onto a set without her secret weapon. Not a script, not a costume, but a mental catalog of other people's sins. Behind her painted smile, Joan Crawford carried a library of leverage. Rumor had it she kept letters in locked drawers, photographs in hidden files, and whispers tucked away for the day she might need them. And in the glittering halls of MGM in the 1930s, nothing was more dangerous than a woman who knew too much. Crawford was no ingenue. She clawed her way from the chorus lines of the 1920s into stardom, turning Lucille Le Sueur into the icon now forever remembered. By the time she starred in Grand Hotel, 1932, she was already reading the industry like a detective novel. Hollywood in those years thrived on secrets, affairs tucked behind studio gates, contracts signed in blood, reputations built on fragile lies. Crawford understood this better than anyone, and while Louis B. Mayer and his fixers built the studio's empire on cover-ups, Crawford learned to weaponize it for herself. It began innocently enough. A dinner party here, a late-night conversation there. She listened, remembered, collected. By the late 1930s, insiders whispered that she had files on everyone who mattered. Executives, fellow stars, even columnists like Luella Parsons. When her career dipped and rivals threatened her standing, she knew exactly when to open those drawers. The story goes that Barbara Stanwyck mysteriously stepped aside from Mildred Pierce, 1945, leaving Crawford the role that would win her an Oscar. Was it pure coincidence, or did Joan quietly make a call reminding someone of a secret better left buried? The darker irony is that Crawford played women who were destroyed by pride, deceit, or ambition. Yet off-screen, she built her survival on those very traits. In smoky studio offices and private drawing rooms, she outmaneuvered enemies not with charm, but with dossiers and whispered threats. Hollywood sold her as the steel-eyed star who endured, but those who worked under her shadow knew better. Joan Crawford didn't just act in melodramas, she lived one. And in the end, her greatest performance was convincing the world she won it honestly. Number 5. John Wayne, the Duke of Deadly Deception. The camera rolled in the Utah desert, but what the crew didn't know was that the sand itself was poisoned. In 1956, John Wayne starred in The Conqueror, filmed downwind from a Nevada nuclear testing site. Dust clung to their costumes, coated their faces, and seeped into their lungs. Years later, cast and crew began dying of cancer at alarming rates, Wayne among them. Hollywood spun it as a tragic coincidence, but survivors whispered that the Duke's greatest performance wasn't on film, but in pretending nothing was wrong. Wayne built his career as America's warrior, the embodiment of patriotism. Films like Stagecoach, 1939, and Sands of Iwo Jima, 1949, sold him as the ultimate soldier. Yet when World War II raged, Wayne didn't enlist. While stars like Jimmy Stewart and Clark Gable put on uniforms for real, Wayne secured deferments and quietly stayed in Hollywood. He played the soldier on screen while others lived the sacrifice. For audiences, the irony was invisible. For those in the industry, it was a shameful open secret. His political crusades only deepened the contradiction. As president of the Motion Picture Alliance in the late 1940s, Wayne publicly condemned colleagues during the Red Scare, helping to blacklist writers and actors. He branded others un-American, while his own career rested on carefully concealed truths. Gossip columnists hinted at these hypocrisies, but Wayne's myth was too valuable. Studios, war departments, and a willing press all helped preserve the fiction. The final act was cruel. By the 1970s, Wayne was fighting cancer, likely seated in the radioactive sands of The Conqueror. The film itself was a flop, mocked for its absurd casting and wooden delivery. But the fallout, literal and metaphorical, lingered. Hundreds of lives had been risked, all in service of a picture destined for ridicule. John Wayne was buried as a national icon, draped in the flag he had so often worn on screen. But beneath the legend lies a truth far darker. The Duke sold America an image of courage, while behind the curtain, his legacy was built on denial, betrayal, and deadly deception. Number 6. Spencer Tracy, Hollywood's holy sinner. The hotel staff learned to fear the sound of breaking glass. Spencer Tracy, drunk and raging, could turn a quiet evening into a storm of shattered bottles and slammed doors. On screen, he was the priest in Boys Town, 1938, the dignified judge in Inherit the Wind, 1960, the moral compass of Hollywood's golden age. But off-screen, his life was a study in contradiction. A man cast as a saint while living as a sinner, protected by MGM's army of fixers. Tracy's demons were no secret in studio backrooms. He would vanish for days into benders, emerging with trembling hands and eyes clouded by regret. Gossip columnists like Luella Parsons hinted at ill health, but never dared describe the truth. MGM executives needed his face steady on the screen, so they cleaned up the wreckage, covering bar fights, paying off hotel bills, smoothing over frightened staff. To audiences, Tracy remained untouched, his halo intact. Then there was the great love affair, one of Hollywood's most famous open secrets. Though married on paper, Tracy spent nearly 3 decades with Katharine Hepburn. Together they shared homes, vacations, and sets, but never public acknowledgement. Studio handlers orchestrated elaborate cover stories, ensuring Tracy remained the image of a devoted husband, while Hepburn was framed as a loyal friend. The deception fooled the public, but insiders saw the cost. Hepburn enduring the shadows, Tracy tortured by his Catholic guilt, and his refusal to divorce. The irony deepened as Tracy's most celebrated roles mirrored his private battles. In Father of the Bride, 1950, he was the weary parent, holding his family together, even as his own household crumbled. In Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, he passed judgment on sins far larger than his own, though his conscience was already heavy with secrets. By the time of his death in 1967, Spencer Tracy was hailed as one of Hollywood's greatest actors. Yet those who knew him whispered a harsher truth, that his most convincing performance was not on celluloid, but in convincing the world he was a man of grace, while behind the curtain he was drowning in his own holy sins. Number 7. Jean Harlow, blonde bombshell, blood on her hands. The note was found on a nightstand, written in neat script but dripping with questions. In September 1932, Paul Byrne, producer and husband of Jean Harlow, was discovered dead in their Beverly Hills home. Officially, the story was suicide. Unofficially, whispers began before the body was even cold, witnesses silenced, evidence tampered with, and MGM's publicity men rushing to the scene before the police had even finished their work. The platinum-haired star of Red Dust, 1932, returned to set within days, her face painted with innocence, while the shadow of death clung to her every move. Jean Harlow had already become the blonde bombshell, the face of early talkies, and the siren who could turn scandal into ticket sales. But her marriage to Paul Byrne was troubled. He was decades older, rumored to struggle with secrets that gnawed at his pride. Friends spoke of bitter arguments, of humiliations and betrayals behind the mansion walls. The note left at his bedside was strangely worded, oddly detached, as though drafted for the cameras instead of for a wife. Why did MGM's Howard Strickling, the studio's legendary fixer, arrive so quickly? And why did details of the crime scene vanish from official reports? Columnists like Luella Parsons hinted at cracks in the story, but the studio's power was immense. MGM needed Harlow untouched, their star asset too valuable to lose in a moral scandal. So the narrative was reshaped. Byrne, the tragic husband, and Jean, the grieving widow, returned to her throne as Hollywood's luminous goddess. But the scandal never fully disappeared. Fans remembered the sparkle in Dinner at 8, 1933, yet they also remembered the tragedy that had followed her name. When Harlow died just 5 years later at only 26 from kidney failure, the whispers returned. Her meteoric rise, her haunted eyes, and the blood-stained legacy, she never escaped. Jean Harlow's life burned bright, dazzling audiences with laughter and allure. But in Hollywood's hidden history, she remains the star whose greatest role may have been surviving a crime scene rewritten by a studio more devoted to profits than to truth. Number 8. Fatty Arbuckle, the scandal that shook Hollywood. The hotel suite smelled of champagne and fear. In September 1921, Virginia Rapp lay dying after a party hosted by Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, the silent era's most beloved comedian. Within hours, headlines screamed accusations of misconduct, and America's laughter turned into outrage. Arbuckle, who had once rivaled Chaplin in fame, was suddenly branded the villain of Hollywood's first great scandal. The studio machine scrambled to contain it, but this time, even the fixers could not bury the damage. Before the tragedy, Arbuckle was Paramount's golden boy, the star of Good Night, Nurse, 1918, and The Roundup, 1920, drawing audiences with his slapstick charm and surprising grace for a man of his size. But the trial that followed stripped away the illusion. 3 times he faced juries, enduring mistrials, sensational testimony, and newspapers that painted him as a monster. Each proceeding revealed not just Arbuckle's reckless lifestyle, but the hidden underbelly of Hollywood itself. Studio-organized cover-ups, payoffs to witnesses, and years of bad behavior swept aside so long as the profits rolled in. Though the final jury acquitted him with an apology, the damage was irreversible. Gossip columnists like Luella Parsons reported every rumor, every whispered sin, until Arbuckle's name was permanently stained. Paramount severed ties, theaters banned his films, and friends vanished in the glare of scandal. The public, still reeling from Prohibition-era hypocrisy, demanded Hollywood clean house. The result was the imposition of morality clauses in actors' contracts and, eventually, the strict enforcement of the Hays Code. Arbuckle's fall became the industry's cautionary tale, one written in ruined careers and lost innocence. In exile, Arbuckle worked under pseudonyms, directing films in shadows, his face absent from the marquees he once lit up. He died in 1933 at just 46. On the very day, he signed a new contract to return to the screen. The comeback Hollywood denied him came only as a footnote in history. Fatty Arbuckle had once been the clown who made the world laugh. But in the end, he became its scapegoat. The man whose scandal shook Hollywood so deeply that the industry built an entire system of censorship to make sure no one like him ever rose again. Number 9. Rock Hudson, the man who wasn't there. The wedding was staged like a movie scene. A tuxedo, a smiling bride, flashing cameras. Yet, those who attended whispered that the marriage was a performance, nothing more. Rock Hudson, Universal's towering leading man, was selling the illusion of the perfect American husband, even as the studio worked furiously to hide the truth. Behind closed doors, agents bribed reporters, publicists rewrote biographies, and contracts arranged lavender marriages to cover a reality that Hollywood decided audiences could never accept. To the world, Rock Hudson was the heartthrob of Magnificent Obsession, 1954, and Pillow Talk, 1959. His broad shoulders, easy grin, and deep voice made him the ideal matinee idol in an age when moviegoers craved stability after the war. But even as women fainted at premieres, Universal executives sat in smoke-filled offices, drafting contingency plans to keep rumors out of print. Confidential magazine, the tabloid notorious for ruining careers, once prepared to out him, only to have their exposé quietly disappear after a payoff and a convenient trade of gossip about other stars. Hudson himself lived like a man split in two. By day, he filmed glossy romances, embodying the all-American male. By night, he sought out private clubs, secret gatherings, and companions carefully chosen by handlers who made sure no trace ever reached the papers. Friends recalled him looking over his shoulder constantly, as though even laughter might be overheard and weaponized. The deception lasted for decades, but it came at a cost. Those who worked with him described an exhaustion that no makeup could conceal. His performances grew heavier, tinged with a sadness audiences couldn't name but could somehow feel. Hollywood demanded he wear a mask so convincing that even those closest to him sometimes believed it. Rock Hudson's death in 1985 revealed the truth the studios had fought to bury, and the public's shock was as much about the decades of lies as it was about his illness. He had been the most visible man in Hollywood, and yet, in many ways, he was never really there at all. Number 10. Mickey Rooney, Hollywood's fallen boy wonder. He once bragged that he'd slept with more women than he could count. And the sad part is, he wasn't exaggerating. Mickey Rooney, the freckle-faced kid who charmed America in MGM's Andy Hardy series, grew up to be one of Hollywood's most destructive forces. Behind the curtain, he was a gambler who left casinos shaking their heads, a husband who couldn't stay faithful, and a temperamental star who cost friends their livelihoods. MGM could cover his debts, smooth his divorces, and hush up his rages, but they could never erase the trail of wreckage he left behind. In the late 1930s, Rooney was the biggest box office draw in the world. His boyish grin sold out theaters from Babes in Arms, 1939, to Strike Up the Band, 1940. But while audiences saw innocence, MGM executives saw something far darker. A young man spiraling out of control. Night after night, he was spotted at racetracks and card tables, throwing away fortunes before dawn. Columnists like Hedda Hopper whispered about his antics, but when a scandal threatened to go public, studio fixers stepped in, paying off debts, silencing waiters, and coaching Mickey back into character. And then came the marriages, 8 in total. His first wife, a teenage Ava Gardner, described the union as a whirlwind of betrayal and humiliation. Friends said he treated romance like another game of cards. Win big, then walk away before the stakes got too high. Each split brought lawsuits, headlines, and bitterness that followed him from set to set. Yet MGM still handed him scripts, still dressed him as America's eternal boy. The bitter irony is that Rooney once symbolized stability, the dependable son every Depression-era family wanted at their dinner table. But off-screen, he was anything but. By the 1950s, when his box office draw had faded, so had the studio's patience. Without MGM's protection, the debts mounted, the scandals surfaced, and the boy wonder who once ruled Hollywood was reduced to cautionary headlines. Hollywood promised him eternal youth. What he gave them instead was a lifetime reminder that corruption doesn't always come in shadows. Sometimes it wears a smile and sings a love song. Number 11. Mary Astor, the diary that could destroy Hollywood. The courtroom gasped as whispers spread. Somewhere in the evidence box sat a diary that could topple careers and ruin marriages across Hollywood. It wasn't just a diary. It was Mary Astor's infamous Purple Diary, pages filled with fiery accounts of her affairs with some of the most powerful men in America. Judges tried to keep it sealed, lawyers begged to keep it out of the press, and studio executives worked the phones in panic. The scandal of a custody battle was suddenly threatening to drag half of Hollywood into the mud. Mary Astor had been a star since the silent era, known for her beauty, and later for films like The Maltese Falcon, 1941. But in 1936, during a bitter divorce from her husband, Dr. Franklin Thorpe, the Purple Diary became the most talked-about object in the industry. Allegedly written in violet ink, it cataloged Astor's intimate encounters with playwright George S. Kaufman, politicians, and other elite figures. For gossip columnists like Luella Parsons, it was pure dynamite. But MGM and Warner Brothers moved quickly to smother the flames. If those pages ever saw print, the fallout would have been catastrophic. Behind closed doors, studios worked like a cartel, pressuring judges, leaning on newspapers, and burying evidence that could taint their stars. Even the jury never saw the full contents, only hints dropped in hushed tones. Rumors spread that the diary contained descriptions too shocking for the public to stomach. But whether the worst of it was true or invention hardly mattered. The very idea was enough to scorch Astor's reputation. And yet, Hollywood has a short memory. Within a few years, Astor was back on screen. Her career revived, delivering an Oscar-winning performance in The Great Lie, 1941. The diary disappeared, supposedly locked away forever, leaving only whispers in its place. Mary Astor lived to old age, long after the ink had faded. But for a moment in 1936, her private scribbles threatened to expose the entire charade of Golden Age Hollywood. The irony is sharp. Her greatest performance may not have been in The Maltese Falcon, but in surviving the diary that almost destroyed her. Number 12. Wallace Reid, the studio's drugged hero. The smell of ether hung in the air as doctors hovered over Paramount's golden boy, not to heal him, but to keep him working. Wallace Reid, America's first true action star, had been badly injured in a 1919 train wreck while filming. Instead of rest, Paramount's physicians pressed morphine into his veins so he could finish the picture. What began as a treatment became a chain. Reid was trapped, an addict made not by choice, but by a studio that valued box office over human life. Reid had been the matinee idol of the silent screen, a handsome daredevil in films like The Roaring Road, 1919, and Excuse My Dust, 1920. Audiences adored his charm, his clean-cut looks, his image as the all-American boy who could race cars, climb mountains, and always win the girl. Behind the silver screen, however, his body was breaking down. The drugs that allowed him to smile through stunts were quietly destroying him. Paramount, terrified of losing their brightest star, looked the other way, covering his absences with excuses and feeding him just enough to keep the cameras rolling. By the early 1920s, the cracks could no longer be hidden. Reid collapsed on sets, his once vibrant energy replaced by a frail exhaustion. Studio fixers spun stories of illness and nervous strain, but insiders knew the truth. His wife, Dorothy Davenport, begged the studio to let him stop, but money spoke louder than mercy. Reid's final film appearances were a shadow of his prime, his face hollow, his movements sluggish, his spark gone. In January 1923, at just 31 years old, Wallace Reid died in a sanitarium, the official cause labeled as complications from illness. Hollywood mourned its golden boy, but the whispers told a harsher truth, that Paramount had worked him to death, turning a beloved star into a casualty of medical corruption. Reid's death shocked the industry, fueling calls for reform and revealing the dark bargain behind stardom. The tragedy lingered as an unspoken warning. In Hollywood's silent age, even heroes could be sacrificed, their lives exchanged for another reel of film. Number 13. Lana Turner, The Sweater Girl, and A Knife in the Dark. The scream echoed through the Beverly Hills mansion, followed by a thud and the sound of breaking glass. When the police arrived on that April night in 1958, Johnny Stompanato, gangster, lover, and enforcer, lay bleeding on Lana Turner's carpet. The official story was shocking enough. Turner's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl, had stabbed him in a desperate act of defense, but the whispers that spread through Hollywood told a darker tale, that Lana herself had wielded the knife, and MGM's fixers had scrambled to rewrite the narrative before dawn. Lana Turner was the Sweater Girl, a star whose beauty made her the envy of America. From The Postman Always Rings Twice, 1946, to Peyton Place, 1957, she played women of desire and danger, characters who lived on the edge of scandal. Off-screen, her own life mirrored her roles. Stompanato, a small-time mobster with ties to Mickey Cohen, had become her constant shadow, controlling, jealous, violent. Gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper hinted at fights so loud they rattled the windows of her Sunset Boulevard home. The night of the stabbing, Turner claimed she and Stompanato had been arguing when Cheryl intervened to protect her mother. Newspapers printed the official version, a tragic act of a frightened girl. Yet detectives whispered about inconsistencies, the angle of the wound, the timing of the statements, the speed with which MGM's publicity men arrived on the scene. Was Hollywood protecting its star by shifting blame onto a child? The jury, swayed by Turner's teary testimony, ruled it justifiable homicide, and the case closed. But the stain never left her. For the rest of her career, Lana carried the weight of suspicion. In films like Imitation of Life, 1959, her performances glimmered with an added fragility, as though art and life had fused into one haunting reflection. Audiences adored her still, but Hollywood insiders knew the truth was far murkier than what the papers had printed. Lana Turner's beauty made her immortal, but the scandal made her unforgettable. She was the star who survived A Knife in the Dark, and left the world forever wondering whose hand had truly held it. Number 14. Marlene Dietrich, the femme fatale who played both sides. She didn't just sign contracts, she rewrote them with threats, charm, and carefully placed whispers. Marlene Dietrich, the sultry star of Shanghai Express, 1932, was more than Hollywood's exotic import. She was a master manipulator who bent studios and lovers alike to her will. Behind the satin gowns and smoky cabaret numbers, she kept dossiers of secrets, leveraging affairs with producers and rivals alike to maintain her iron grip on fame. Dietrich's screen presence was electric. The top hat and tuxedo in Morocco, 1930, the iconic kiss that dared censors to act, the languid stare that made her one of the defining faces of pre-code Hollywood. But what audiences didn't see were the quiet deals struck in backrooms, where she wielded gossip like a dagger. Studio executives who crossed her often found their scandals in the hands of columnists, like Hedda Hopper. Rivals who tried to outshine her suddenly discovered themselves frozen out of casting calls. Marlene's power wasn't just beauty, it was blackmail, skillfully masked as sophistication. And then came the war. When World War II erupted, Dietrich positioned herself as a vocal opponent of Hitler, renouncing Germany and performing tirelessly for Allied troops. To some, she was a heroine. To others, the whispers of espionage clung to her tailored suits and soldier's boots. Was she merely an entertainer? Or was she funneling information as she toured battlefronts? FBI files suggested she was more than just a singer with a microphone, though the truth was buried under patriotism and publicity. By the 1950s, her career slowed, but her grip on her image only tightened. Dietrich engineered her own legend with surgical precision. Every photograph approved, every interview rehearsed. Behind the glamour, she lived in semi-seclusion, her once commanding presence shrinking into carefully guarded myth. Marlene Dietrich remains immortal in Hollywood's memory, the femme fatale who blurred the line between seduction and strategy. But the irony endures. For all her glamour, her greatest performance may not have been on the silver screen at all, but in convincing Hollywood that she was untouchable, even while pulling its strings from the shadows. Number 15. Judy Garland, the star devoured by pills. She was barely a teenager when studio doctors began sliding pills across her dressing room table. One to wake her up, one to keep her thin, one to send her to sleep after 18-hour shoots. By the time Judy Garland stood on that yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz, 1939, she was already living under chemical chains. America's sweetheart turned into Hollywood's most tragic captive. MGM sold innocence, but behind closed doors, they manufactured dependency. Garland's rise was meteoric. From Babes in Arms, 1939, to Meet Me in St. Louis, 1944, her voice defined a generation. Yet every dazzling performance came at a cost. Executives demanded she maintain a girlish figure, feeding her amphetamines to suppress hunger and barbiturates to force rest. Gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper described her as frail but radiant, never mentioning that the glow was built on exhaustion and chemicals. Studio handlers hovered constantly, ensuring the illusion of vitality, even as Judy trembled under the weight of it. By the 1940s, the cracks showed. Garland collapsed on sets, missed call times, and wept through costume fittings. Instead of offering mercy, MGM doubled down, issuing suspensions, staging comebacks, and pushing her into headlines that painted her as unstable rather than abused. The most famous example came during Annie Get Your Gun, 1950, when she was fired after repeated absences. To the public, it was Garland's failure. In truth, it was the inevitable fallout of years of exploitation. Her marriages fared no better. Seeking escape, Judy fell into a series of tumultuous relationships that often mirrored her struggles with control. Friends recalled her desperation for stability, a home, a life not dictated by contracts and pills. But Hollywood had imprinted too deeply. The chaos followed her wherever she went. In later years, her voice still soared in A Star is Born, 1954, but it carried an ache audiences could feel in their bones. Garland died in 1969, her body overwhelmed by the very substances that had been forced upon her since youth. The cruelest irony of all, the girl who sang of dreams over the rainbow had been trapped in a cage built by the very studio that promised her stardom. Number 16. Marlon Brando, the rebel without restraint. The chairs flew first. Then the shouting began. Directors, producers, and co-stars learned quickly. When Marlon Brando's temper flared, no one was safe. Off-screen, the man hailed as Hollywood's greatest actor was just as volatile as the characters he played. From violent outbursts on set to betrayals of those closest to him, Brando's personal life became a storm of chaos that mirrored the raw power he unleashed in films like A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951, and On the Waterfront, 1954. Brando revolutionized acting with his brooding intensity, dragging Hollywood from polished artifice into a new era of realism. Yet the genius came at a price. He was notoriously difficult to work with, storming off sets, mocking directors, and rewriting scripts without permission. On Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962, his antics ballooned the budget and drove the production into infamy. Crew members called it sabotage. Brando dismissed it as art. His arrogance left a trail of broken collaborations, but studios kept hiring him because audiences couldn't look away. Then came the affairs. Brando boasted of countless conquests, men and women alike, treating intimacy as both indulgence and weapon. Rumors swirled of relationships left in ruin, children he barely acknowledged, and lovers betrayed for the sake of ego. His charm could disarm, but just as quickly, it could cut. For gossip columnists, Brando was a goldmine, the rebel who couldn't restrain himself even when the cameras stopped rolling. His betrayals extended beyond love. Friends and collaborators often discovered their ideas lifted, their loyalty disregarded. Even allies like Elia Kazan, who gave Brando his greatest roles, felt the sting of his sharp tongue once Brando no longer needed them. The rebel who had once embodied integrity on screen often lived the opposite off it. By the 1970s, Brando resurged with The Godfather, 1972, cementing his immortality. But his private life was crumbling. Lawsuits, family tragedies, and a reclusive bitterness that made his final years a shadow of his prime. The irony endures. Brando gave Hollywood some of its most profound truths about humanity, yet lived a life riddled with chaos, betrayal, and indulgence. He was the rebel without restraint, a genius undone by the very fire that made him unforgettable. Number 17. Rita Hayworth, the love goddess. Exploited and exploiting, the Marquis called her the love goddess. But Rita Hayworth knew better than anyone that the title was both crown and curse. On screen, she shimmered, stripping off a black satin glove in Gilda, 1946, the most scandalous striptease of its time. Off-screen, she was locked in contracts that treated her body like a commodity and her private life like a battlefield. Columbia Studios sold her as the ultimate fantasy, even as they destroyed her marriages and demanded she play the part in life as well as film. Hayworth's rise was carefully manufactured. Harry Cohn, Columbia's iron-fisted boss, forced her into endless makeovers, from her name change to painful electrolysis to alter her hairline. She was the studio's prized possession, and Cohn made sure everyone knew it. To disobey him meant career suicide. So Rita complied, smiling for cameras while trapped in a system of exploitation. Even her marriage to Orson Welles, the wunderkind behind Citizen Kane, 1941, became tabloid fodder. Their union burned bright but collapsed under pressure, with both sides accusing the other of betrayal. But Rita was no mere victim. She learned to wield her image as a weapon. using affairs and connections to stay relevant in an industry that discarded women as quickly as yesterday's film reels. Whispers followed her from Hollywood to European courts, where she married Prince Ali Khan in 1949, trading stardom for royalty, at least for a time. The studio loathed losing her, yet Columbia still cashed in on the publicity, spinning the scandal into headlines that kept her marketable. By the 1950s, the cracks in the facade grew wider. Multiple divorces, custody battles, and failed comebacks left her weary. In later years, her tragic decline, memory fading, health collapsing, was framed as simple misfortune. Yet, those who knew her remembered the scars left by decades of manipulation, both by the men who controlled her and by the power she sometimes turned back on them. Rita Hayworth remains immortal as Hollywood's love goddess. But behind the satin gloves and the torch songs was a woman trapped in a dance of exploitation. Sometimes the prey, sometimes the predator, but always paying the price. Hollywood's golden glow was built on secrets, scandals, and lives sacrificed for illusion. These stories remind us that behind the glamour lay shadows. Share your thoughts below. And if you want more untold truths of the silver screen, subscribe, comment, and join us for the next chapter.